ought to be a nice review here for you. Okay, so let's talk about the different, well, little kind of quiz here for you. There we go. You have 4 tissues in the body. Remember the 4 tissue types, chapter 5. Okay, when we were talking about tissues. Do y'all remember the 4 tissue types in the body? Epithelial. Yep. So epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. This is obviously going to be connective tissue. Specifically, this is supporting connective tissue. This chapter is going to focus on bone and cartilage, right? But mainly our skeletal system here. All right, so a lot of this chapter will spend talking on the bones, but we will talk about some of these other tissues there. All right, so when we're looking at bones, right, keep in mind, each bone in your body is considered an organ. Like your liver is an organ, like your kidneys are organs, your pancreas. Your bones are organs of the skeletal system. They're made up of more than one type of tissue. We'll go through that and we'll discuss the different types of tissue that are going to be associated with the bones here. I mean, for the most part, when we think of our skeleton, we think about the hard characteristics of the skeleton. It gives us this structural framework that gives our body its specific form, right? And then some of the things that we've mentioned in lab, how it offers, protection, like our skull protects our brain, our vertebral column protects our spinal cord, our thoracic cage protects our internal organs like our heart and lungs. So it does play a huge role, all right, and we'll talk about some of these functions, but keep in mind, its rigidity gives us, all right, a nice framework that some of the other systems in our body can kind of rely on and play off of, which we'll talk about here in a second. All right, so when we're talking about bone, let me go back to this slide here. We'll be talking about, obviously, bones, cartilage, ligaments, and then some of the other connective tissue, which we'll go through, like periosteum, which is the covering of bone, perichondrium, which is the covering to cartilage. So we'll kind of wind through that. So in lab, we learned about there's 2 types of bone. There's the compact bone and the spongy bone, right? And so the name of it basically tells you some of its characteristics. All right, now compact is also known as dense or cortical bone, right? But just like the name says, it's compact. So compact bone makes up most of the weight of a bone when you're looking at a bone. In fact, it makes up 80% of the bone mass there. So that's a pretty sizable amount. But when we learn the anatomy of the bone, we're going to be, interested to see that there's the other type of bone, the spongy bone or the trabecular bone there. That bone there, okay, it might appear that it takes up more volume, right? But it's not as dense, so its mass will be less. So therefore, it makes up a much smaller amount. You can see it only makes up about 20%. And so spongy bone is just that. When you say the name and you look at that bone, it looks like a sponge. There's holes in it, all right? It's porous. And so part of that is because of we're going to learn that another type of tissue in there, your bone marrow, is going to kind of fill up some of those spaces there that we'll learn about, called trabeculae there. So just kind of keep in mind that spongy bone is just like it says, it looks like a sponge, but it is just inside or internal to compact bone. So much like the shell of an egg would be like the compact bone and the yolk would be the spongy bone. It's just inside. Okay, so the compact bone's on the outside, spongy bone's more internal on the inside there. All right, then our next tissue that we'll be talking about in this chapter is cartilage. We learned quite a bit about cartilage and some of its characteristics and functions in chapter 5, right? But cartilage is similar to bone, except it's not as rigid, so there's more flexibility. That's because it has, all right, several characteristics like the protein fibers that help to make it, but its ground substance has a little bit more water in it, so it'll give it more of a flexibility. And so we'll talk about the different types of cartilage. The 2 types of cartilage that are pretty much associated with this chapter is going to be hyaline cartilage, right? And then our fibrocartilage. And so hyaline cartilage is the more common, much more abundant type of cartilage. We're going to learn all the places that you're going to find it. You're going to find it, all right? It's going to line the ends of your bone. Okay, so when we haven't gotten to the appendicular skeleton yet. But we did learn about the ribs in the thoracic cage there. That cartilage, right, that attaches the rib to the sternum, that is hyaline cartilage, right? And so you'll see hyaline cartilage in places like in the rib cage there, the costal cartilage. We'll see it on the ends of bones, like in your fingers and your knees, all right? A lot of your joints will have the hyaline cartilage, which we call articular cartilage, that lines the end of the bone because it makes it more smooth. The fetal skeleton is primarily going to be hyaline cartilage before it starts to convert over into bone. So we'll talk about that whole process in this chapter here. Fibrocartilage is the weight-bearing cartilage. It's going to be in places that are going to have a lot of compressive forces acting on it. So our spine, like the intervertebral discs, that's made up of hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage. Also in our knees, the menisci, again, a lot of compressive forces, especially if you're standing. That's going to be where fibrocartilage is located. Then also in the pubic symphysis, that's where your two hip bones meet in the front. So we'll learn about that in lab. So if you're not sure what the pubic symphysis is, don't worry. We'll learn about it in lab and you'll know exactly to which I'm talking about. All right, so some other tissue that we're going to cover in this chapter is going to be our structural tissues like tendons and ligaments. And you remember those are dense, regular connective tissue, very strong, right? And so in healthy tissue, sometimes our ligaments can have the tensile strength of steel, right? Depends on which the forces are applied. So we'll talk about all these wondrous different types of tissues that we will see in this chapter. If you look at this picture here, you can see this is showing us, right, where this cartilage that I just mentioned, you'll see wherever we see blue, that's the location for the hyaline cartilage. Notice inside the joints there, lining the bones. All right, it's also going to be the cartilage on our thoracic cage here. The fibrocartilage is going to be found in compression force areas, and so that's going to be in your spine. The pubic symphysis here in the front, and then in the menisci here in the knees. But lots of hyaline cartilage all over the place. Okay, so some of these functions for the skeleton, most of you know at least half of these just from common observation. All right, the first one, support and protection. Well, that makes sense, all right? Our bones provide that rigid framework, right, that we experience. And so, how I said before, how the skull protects the brain. So there's where we get our protection from. Levers for movement. We don't really cover, all right, levers in this course, but we know that muscles attach to bones and muscles move bones at joints. And so that's what we're talking about. Those muscles there, when they're contracting and relaxing, will create movement, and that movement, all right, will cause the bones to move. So those bones act as levers. Right? Hemopoiesis, very important function that your bones undergo, and that's the creation of what we call the formed blood elements. What are those? Your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets, right? So all of those cells are made in your bone marrow, right? Which is going to be housed in the medullary cavity of some of the bones or in the trabecular bone there, and we'll touch on that. Right? Specifically, the type of bone marrow that makes, all right, the formed blood elements is going to be the red bone marrow, because you have yellow bone marrow, which we'll talk about maybe today, right? And you have red bone marrow. Red bone marrow, think of it as the active bone marrow. That's the bone marrow that's making, right, those cells that I was telling you about. One that's really often kind of overlooked here for functions for bone is storage site. It's a storage site for very valuable material, minerals like calcium. Now, everyone, when they think of calcium, they think strong teeth and bones, all right? But we're going to learn some of the important functions in regards to muscle contraction and nerve activity. Those are very highly crucial processes. And so your bones store calcium. Amongst calcium, there's magnesium, right? And there's phosphate. Phosphate we need for ATP. Right, and so it's stored in the bone matrix, and so we can utilize, right, these resources at a time. All right, for example, if our energy is low because we don't have enough phosphate to make ATP, no problem. We start breaking down our bone, not to the point where you become osteoporotic or anything like that, but we start to break down the bone a little bit, release phosphate into the bloodstream. Phosphate then travels around to all the different tissues there, and your cells can now use that phosphate to make ATP. So we'll see that's one of the important qualities or functions here of bone. Now this slide here, the next couple of slides, are just going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these functions that I just mentioned here, all right? So I'm not going to really spend too much time on it here, but you can see here for support and structure or protection here, right? Obviously, the first bullet point up there is provide structural support. This framework is going to give us protection in those certain regions of your skeleton, thoracic cavity, right? Your skull and your vertebral column. They'll protect important sensitive tissues there, right? Movement, like I said, the bones there are the attachment sites for several of our skeletal muscles, right? In regards to movement activity, but also we'll see skin will attach onto our bones, other tissues and other organs may also attach onto our bones, all right, to help, all right? It's almost like hanging Christmas lights. You got to hang them somewhere. And so we have to attach tissue somewhere on the internal structures of your body. So your bones make a good point of attachment for several of those. And so because of the skeletal muscles attaching onto the bones, that's how we're able to get that system of lever action and movements there, right? When the muscles contract and relax, because it exerts a force on the bones there, right? Like I said, hemopoiesis here, right? Keep in mind, this occurs in our red bone marrow, and it's going to then create the cells that make up our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and our platelets. All right, so that term, hemopoiesis, that is how we create blood cell production. Notice I don't say red blood cells because there are white blood cells and then there are platelets there. And then finally, the storage site there for minerals and then for our energy reserves here. Right, so here, this kind of goes over the importance here of calcium, and we'll talk about 2 out of the 3 of these. Blood clotting you'll talk about in 211, but again, you can see the importance of calcium, right? It's not just important for strong teeth and bones, right? You absolutely need it for muscle contractions to occur, and you absolutely need it for proper nerve signal transmission, and you'll understand that when we get to those chapters in chapters 10 and 12. All right, like I said about the phosphate, we need it for ATP. Also, we'll find it in some of our phospholipids. You remember phospholipids? That is going to be the phospho-containing fat. And so that phosphate-containing fat is, in fact, the most abundant type of lipid in your body because it's in every single cell in the plasma membrane there. So we need it not only for ATP, but to make, all right, our plasma membrane there. Okay. So this is a little bit more of an anatomy kind of topic to discuss, but the classification of bones. And so there's 4 classes for bones: long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. All right, so when you think of a long bone, most of us will think of the femur bone. That's the bone in your thigh, or maybe your humerus, which is the bone in your arm, or the radius or ulna, which is another long bone in your forearm. Right, so the long bones, just like it says up there, they're greater in length than they are in width, like a columnar cell. Columnar cell was taller than it was wide. And so that's what your long bone is going to be. It's going to be longer in length, all right, and shorter in width. Short bones, again, these bones, the definition says nearly equal to width in all directions. So some of those bones you might want to think of are going to be the bones in your wrist, the carpal bones. Right, they're relatively small bones, right? They're almost as wide as they are tall, right? So the short bones, just have a good idea of what a long bone looks like, and a short bone is not anything like that. It's going to be a smaller, think of it like almost like a cuboid cell, okay? And then our flat bones, again, squamous, okay, but this is flat. So these bones are going to have a nice flat surface, and a lot of times these bones will be thin compared to some of the other bones in your body. So your cranial bones are a perfect example of flat bones, all right? They are pretty flat, okay? They're going to be thinner than, say, like the femur is going to be, or some of your tarsal bones there, right? And your ribs are another example of a flat bone, right? You would think that they would be a long bone, but they are not considered to be long bones. They are considered to be flat bones there. And then we made up a category for all the other weird bones that we couldn't fit into the other 3 categories, and that's going to be the irregular bones. And so these are those bones that look funky, right? So like a vertebrae, They look much different than a short bone, than a long bone, all right, than a flat bone. All right, so they're going to have very complex or elaborate shape there. So those are going to be your four categories. So long bones, short bones, flat bones, or regular bones. Right, just kind of have a decent idea as to where those kind of fit in. In lab, we haven't really gone over the bones that we've discussed in lab are pretty much flat bones because those are your cranial bones there. Right, and then some of the facial bones, there's going to be some irregular bones thrown into that. And then we really haven't hit any of the long bones yet. We won't see those really until we get into the appendicular skeleton, right? All right, so I'm going to skip all this because, well, I'll show you the pictures here. So here's some nice examples of the long bones here. And just like where you would think they would be, right? These bones are going to be longer than they are wide. So in your extremities, in your fingers and whatnot, okay, short bones, nearly equal length to width. So these are going to be your carpal bones, the bones in your wrist, and then the tarsal bones, the bones down in your foot there. And then sesamoid bones fall into this category. What's a sesamoid bone? It's a bone that resides in a tendon. So like your kneecap, the patella, that's a sesamoid bone because it is in your quadriceps tendon. You have sesamoid bones, right, down by the base of your thumb here. And then you also have sesamoid bones down by the base of your big toe. Okay, and they're just bones that just live and sit down and reside in tendons there. Okay, the flat bones here, again, flat, thin surfaces. They can have a curvature to them. So you can see all of these different, all right, examples of flat bones. Skull, scapula, all right, sternum, and the ribs. We haven't talked about the scapula yet. That's the shoulder blade. And we haven't talked, well, we did talk about the sternum there. So here you can see some examples of flat bones. I personally think the scapula should be more of an irregular bone, but I'm not an anatomist. All right, and then our irregular bones. These are the ones that are the leftover. They have the elaborate shapes there. You can see all the funky looking bones here. Like that thing lives in your head. That's the ethmoid bone. It looks freaky, but that's your ethmoid bone, and that helps to form, all right, your part of your perpendicular plate, part of your bony nasal septum. This center part right there, that long kind of projection coming down, that is one of the two bones that makes up your bony nasal septum. The vomer was the other one here. And that's the sphenoid bone. I mean, that thing looks like a butterfly, bat, something. Okay, so staying on kind of like the anatomy topic here, I'm going to go through and talk to you about the different regions of a long bone, because a lot of the time in this chapter is we're going to be learning about how bones grow, how bones transition from a cartilage model into a bony model, right? We use the example of a long bone to display a lot of this. So I'm going to talk about the anatomy of a long bone. So we're going to start off, right, with one of my awful drawings here. So this is my version of a long bone. All right, so this long part here, which most people would want to call the shaft, that is called the diaphysis. So I will no longer be using shaft, right? That is the diaphysis. So for your thigh, the middle of your thigh, that is going to be the diaphysis of the femur bone. And it extends from one end of the bone to the other end of the bone. And I'll describe what those are, these knobby parts that you can see that I drew up here, right? It's called an epiphysis. We'll get there. So in the diaphysis of a mature bone, it's a hollow space. Okay, there's a space inside of the diaphysis there, and that's called the medullary cavity. And so in younger people, children, okay, because for the most part, their whole skeleton is undergoing hemopoiesis. But as you grow into an adult, like everybody here, then certain parts of the appendicular skeleton, that bone marrow stops producing, all right, blood cells. And I'll talk about what happens to that bone marrow. And then other parts of your axial skeleton, like your vertebra, your skull, right? Parts of your appendicular skeleton, which we'll get into, they'll continue to undergo hemopoiesis, right? So when you're young, the majority of your body is going to, or I should say the majority of the skeleton is going to be filled with red bone marrow, and they're going to be producing blood cells. But as you get older like us, right, mainly your axial skeleton is producing the red blood, or producing the blood cells, and then a lot of the parts of the appendicular skeleton, that red bone marrow turns into yellow bone marrow. And we'll talk about that in a second. But for what I want you to know, the medullary cavity is just a hollow space in the center of the bone. All right, on each end of the bone, you have an epiphysis. And like it says there for the description, it's a knobby region. So you'll have this knobby region on each end of the bone. And so if you have two knobs, that means one end is closer to the axial skeleton. So that's going to be the proximal epiphysis. The other end is going to be further away from the axial skeleton, which is your trunk, and that's going to be the distal epiphysis. So if this was your shoulder joint right here, this knob right up here at the top, that's the proximal epiphysis. That would be your shoulder. And then the other end, that would be down by your elbow, that would be the distal epiphysis there. So we're going to see when we're looking here in our long bone, remember what I said when we talked about the two different types of bone. You've got compact and spongy. The compact is going to be on the outside, and the spongy will be just deep to it. I'll show you a much better picture here. I'll show it to you. And then finally, our articular cartilage, which is going to be located on the epiphysis, because that's usually going to be where a joint is going to be found. And so it kind of lines that epiphysis. And its job is to act as a shock absorber, and it helps to reduce friction. Because friction is not your friend, especially when you get older. You've heard people say, you know, I've worn away all my cartilage in whatever joint they're talking about, and it's bone on bone, right? And so that's very painful because bone is very sensitive to pain. And so what happens is the articular cartilage protects the underlying bone because it reduces the friction. So the bones will slide by each other. So that articular cartilage is very important that you know that it does these two things, reduces friction, and it's a shock absorber. Okay. Then the last two things to talk about, hopefully I'll have a good drawing here for you. Right. Where the epiphysis starts to kind of taper down. So kind of like this region right here. It's not quite in the diaphysis where the shaft is, and it's not quite in the epiphysis. It's kind of like this triangular area here where it's kind of tapering down. That's known as the metaphysis. And this is where you're going to see the growth plate. So in the metaphysis is where we have what we call the epiphyseal plate, also known as the growth plate. So when you're an adolescent, when you're a child, this area is usually going to be made up of cartilage, a mixture of cartilage and bone, depending on what zone you're in. And we'll learn this later on, right? But you're going to have the cartilage, you'll have cells in this area constantly making cartilage. Then that cartilage dies, and then where that dead cartilage is located, bone replaces it. So we'll learn that whole process. Essentially, when you're growing, you make cartilage, the cartilage dies, bone cells move in and turn that area into bone. And we'll go through all that fun stuff. So eventually, when you are all grown up and you're done, then that metaphysis there, that epiphyseal plate, it will fuse. It'll become all bone. All the cartilage is done, it's gone, and that whole area then, all right, becomes bone. And it's no longer going to be cartilage there. And so we call that the epiphyseal line. So this is where, you know, you hear about a skeleton being found out in the woods somewhere, and they're trying to determine the age of the skeleton. So if they can see a growth plate in there, then they know the skeleton's of a certain age, depending what growth plate it is and whatnot. But if there's no growth plate, then they can assume it's an adult. And so they're able to tell. There's other ways, and we'll talk about that stuff if we have time. So here you can see all those regions that I was trying to tell you for our long bone here. So here's the diaphysis. That's the long shaft of the bone. In an adult, you'll have a hollow cavity in the center, and that's called the medullary cavity. Tons of blood vessels in there, tons of nerves in there. And you'll also see, all right, you'll have bone marrow in there. All right, and then at the ends of each bone, you can see you have the epiphysis. So for this example, this is a humerus. So this is the arm bone there. This epiphysis is up by the shoulder. So this is going to be the proximal epiphysis. And then you can see where the epiphysis starts to taper down into the diaphysis, this region here. This is where the growth plate would be. But obviously, this is an adult humerus, and so it's fused, and so there's the epiphyseal line. So we don't see the growth plate there because it's gone. Okay, we'll talk about some of the other stuff there. What this picture is kind of showing you here, let me zoom in one more time. Whoops. How do I turn this off? Okay. We're going to be talking about this here in a second, the periosteum. So the periosteum is this covering that you're going to see on the outside of bone. And we're going to learn that it's made up of two layers. You've got an outer layer, which is made up of dense irregular connective tissue, and then you have an inner layer, which is made up of all these different types of cells that we're going to talk about here. So let's talk about the periosteum here. Okay, so all of our bones have this nice organic covering to them. And this organic covering, this periosteum, is going to provide a couple different functions. One, the outer layer is made up of that dense irregular connective tissue, so we call it the outer fibrous layer. And so this is the layer that your tendons and your ligaments and some other structures can actually attach onto. So the fact that it's made up of dense irregular connective tissue, and we said this in chapter 5 when we were talking about tissues, one of the nice things about dense irregular connective tissue is that it can sustain multiple stresses and forces in what we call multi-directional forces. So you can pull on, all right, dense irregular connective tissue in a lot of different directions, and it can handle that, which makes it the perfect covering for the fibrous layer of the periosteum there. So you're going to see tendons and ligaments, you're going to see blood vessels anchored to it. So it's a good attachment site there. And then deep to that, we have what we call the intercellular layer. And so that the name of that layer tells you exactly, right, what we're going to find. One, it's internal to the fibrous layer, and two, cellular. So we're going to see cells in there. We'll talk about the different cells there, right? But all of these cells have to do with producing bone. They play a role in bone production. All right, the last one does play a role, but it's more of like a destructive role, but we'll talk about that. All right, so that's what we're going to see with the periosteum. And then also, we have to attach that periosteum to the bone itself. And so what you saw in this previous picture here, whoops, that's the wrong way. What you saw, I'll zoom in. On this previous picture, you saw like these little spiky, spindly looking things here. And those are called the perforating fibers, also known as Sharpie's fibers. But they will attach the periosteum to the compact bone. Remember, the compact bone's the outer portion of the bone. And so these perforating fibers will allow, all right, they're made of collagen, so they're pretty strong. They'll allow the periosteum to essentially attach itself onto the compact bone on the outside. Right, so those are perforating fibers. So that's what you're seeing here. Here's the compact bone. Here's the periosteum, and it's made up of those two layers, right? That pinkish outer layer, that's the fibrous layer. That's just dense irregular connective tissue. And then just internal to that layer, you'll see this thin layer, right? And it almost looks like the cells are end to end, and that's the cellular layer. And so we'll talk about the role of the cells, but they live right on the inside of that. So the cells are outside to the compact bone, but they're deep or inside to the fibrous layer of the periosteum. All right, so the periosteum's on the outside of the bone. Well, guess what? We got another layer, all right, or another covering that's going to be on the inside of the bone, and that's called the endosteum. So the endosteum is going to literally cover everything, all the nooks and crannies on the inside of the medullary cavity. And so we'll also see here in the endosteum more cells. So we're going to see the same cells, osteoprogenitor cells, osteoblasts, and osteoclasts. All of them will be in the endosteum. So we saw them in the periosteum outside the compact bone. Now we're also going to see a layer of cells on the inside, on the endosteum, right? That's going to line the medullary cavity. So when we talk about all the internal structures of the bone within the medullary cavity, we're basically saying, right, you're going to have this endosteum running all over the place on the inside, all over the trabecular or the spongy bone. So we'll see a nice picture of that here. Here you can see, again, it's so to kind of give you some perspective because you might not know where you're at. Zoom back in. So if you notice, and I can't zoom in anymore, if you notice here you can see the compact bone, and then just deep to the compact bone, you can see the spongy bone. You see those little holes there, right? All those little perforations. That's the spongy bone, right? The trabecular bone. So the periosteum is on the outside. The endosteum is just on the inside here. So that spongy bone, right, that endosteum is going to cover, all right, all the little trabeculae, all these little spicules here that you see here. It's going to be covered with this cell layer here, right? And again, it's made up of all these various cells, which we'll learn. We'll talk about them. All right, one other thing to talk about, since we're still talking about the anatomy here of bones, mainly we're going to be focusing on long bones. But one of the things that we should mention when we're dealing with the other three classes, short, flat, and irregular, right? They don't have a medullary cavity. Long bones are the only ones that have a medullary cavity. You might want to make a note of that, right? So now these bones are still going to have periosteum that cover the outside. But since they don't have a medullary cavity, right, therefore, we're not going to really see so much the endosteum there. So it's, imagine, like, I like sandwiches. Well, I love peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. So when you make a sandwich, it's usually 2 slices of bread and whatever you're putting in between the 2 slices of bread. Right? So that's essentially especially when we talk about some of our flat bones here, for example, right? When you're looking at a flat bone, you're going to essentially think of the bread as the compact bone, and whatever you're going to fill the sandwich with, in my case, peanut butter, that's going to be the spongy bone or the trabecular bone. So there's no medullary cavity there. So when we're dealing here in the skull, right, we have this term called diploid. And that's what we call the spongy bone in the skull. I'll show you a picture. I think I got one. Yeah, I do. I'll come right back to that slide, I promise you. So this is what I'm talking about. Here is, all right, a sample from one of the cranial bones here. You'll notice you've got a compact bone layer on the outside and a compact bone layer on the inside. Periosteum is going to cover this bone on the outside. It's also going to cover this bone on the inside. But notice, since there's no medullary cavity, we're not going to see the endosteum in there. So it's just compact bone, all right, spongy bone, and then more compact bone if we're talking about a flat bone. Okay, but keep that in mind, no medullary cavity. All right, so kind of like the filling inside of this situation, it's just going to be all spongy. Okay, so that's going to be anatomy for those. Now, let's talk about, remember what I said, our bones, all right, are organs. And organs have different types of tissue within them, but organs, just like your heart's an organ, your pancreas, your stomach, right? It needs sustenance. So you're going to have a blood supply going to those organs and leaving those organs. You're going to have nerves going to those organs, and in some cases, leaving those organs, right? So your bone is no different. And in fact, your bone, right, what did I say? One of its functions is to store minerals and energy reserves. So that's pretty important. We just saw how important calcium is. So we're going to store the calcium, but that calcium storage is not going to do us any good if we don't have a way of getting that calcium from your bone to whatever tissue or organ needs that calcium. So how do we handle that? We're just going to lay down a whole bunch of blood vessels, right? We're going to make your bones highly vascularized, which means they've got lots of arteries and veins and other blood vessels going to and from those tissues there, right? So where do they enter into your bone? They're going to enter from the periosteum. And if we're talking about a long bone, usually in a long bone, usually mid-shaft, but you'll have a hole, and I'm drawing it much bigger than what it is. It's usually about as big as the tip of your pen or pencil. And so this hole that usually goes right into the diaphysis there. And that's where arteries can enter into the bone and where veins can exit. And that's where nerves will enter into the bone, right? So you're going to see here, right, that structure, that hole, we call that a nutrient foramen. And that's for your blood vessels to enter and exit from the actual internal part of the bone there. Now, your bone is also highly innervated. So vascularization has to do with blood. Innervation has to do with the nerves. So you have quite a lot of nerves, mainly sensory nerves. And so these sensory nerves will tell your nervous system what's going on with your bones, right? Say you have, we don't have to worry about this because I don't think that interstellar space travel will be around during our lifetimes. But if you were to go from planet Earth to a planet that has much more gravity, for example, I think Mercury or Venus, the gravity there is 5 times that of Earth. So you're going to weigh 5 times your weight there. Well, you can't sustain that for a long period of time. So your body will start to compensate and start to build more bone. And we'll learn about that process, right, from the mechanical stresses of such. And so these sensory nerves will help, all right, promote, all right, bone reconfiguration. If you lost a lot of weight, then your bone density might decrease a little bit. If you gain a lot of weight, or if you go to another planet and become much more heavier, then your body will start to increase bone density. That's why, I don't know if you know this, I don't know how many people are interested in astronauts, but when they're up in space, especially if they're up in space for a prolonged period of time, some of these guys go on a mission for like a year or so, they will walk on a treadmill in space. I don't know if you've ever seen it. They're walking on a treadmill with these big, it looks like a big rubber band that holds them on top of the treadmill. And so that process of them walking and that rubber band kind of holding them onto the surface of the treadmill helps to promote body weight, because we'll learn here in a moment. Well, I don't know if we'll learn today, but that your body weight helps your bone density. That's why they're always telling older folks to walk. People that have osteoporosis or osteopenia, one of the best things that you can tell them to do is to walk, because that helps build up bone, the bone matrix. All right. So the next tissue that we're going to talk about is bone marrow. We're not going to get into a lot of the specific details, but I want you to be able to differentiate some of the differences between red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow, right? But bone marrow, obviously, like the name says, is going to be, right, a connective tissue that resides in the bone. Now, we talked about the red bone marrow. That's the active bone marrow that is going to be constantly making, right, our blood cells, right? That process is called hemopoiesis, right? And so this type of tissue, this should look familiar to you. Remember reticular connective tissue? That's that connective tissue that I told you that makes a lot of compartments and whatnot. And you'll see it in lymphatic tissues, but also in our bone marrow, right? So that's what this tissue is. That's what red bone marrow is. It's a reticular, all right, connective tissue, which means it has a lot of compartments in there, as it's going to be helping to form our bone cells there, our blood cells. And so we'll also see, right, some fat tissue in there, mainly the adipocytes will be playing, and we'll talk about its purpose there. But in kids, right, pretty much your long bones, in addition to the other bones, right, are going to have red bone marrow in it. In adults, that red bone marrow becomes inactive and it converts itself into yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is primarily made up of adipose tissue. Right. Now I'll get back to the yellow bone marrow in a second. In adults, most of our hemopoietic tissue is going to be in our axial skeleton, and then some parts of our appendicular skeleton. All right, so if you look here, skull, axial skeleton, vertebra, axial skeleton, ribs, sternum, all again, axial skeleton. And then the other parts that are remaining are going to be your hip bones, known as the os coxa. And then we just learned what the proximal epiphysis is, right? The proximal epiphysis of your humerus, which is up here in your shoulder, and then the proximal epiphysis of your femur, which is down in your hip. All right, so pretty much the proximal epiphysis of the humerus and the femur, not a huge area compared to the axial skeleton and whatnot. The yellow bone marrow, that is going to be your inactive bone marrow. So in us, in our long bones, that red bone marrow has degenerated into now this fatty looking substance, primarily made up of adipose tissue. The good news is, if you need to make blood cells, this yellow bone marrow can convert into red bone marrow. So someone that becomes anemic, right, we may see, right, that some areas of their long bones, that bone marrow has become active again and is starting to produce blood cells, depending on what the anemia is and whatnot. Right, so in a pinch, right, we can utilize that yellow bone marrow. Now, unfortunately, yellow bone marrow is also the same substance that people can become very concerned about if you suffer, all right, a complete break in one of your long bones. And they worry about an embolus. You can get what's known as a fat embolus, especially if there's a ruptured blood vessel involved. And so that's usually one of the things that they are concerned about. If you ever completely fracture your femur, aside from the fact that it's incredibly painful, right, it's incredibly dangerous because there's a possibility that some of that yellow bone marrow can get shaken loose from the medullary cavity and get into your bloodstream and cause a fat embolus. That's one of the first things that they will look for, all right, if you have a diagnosed long bones fracture, complete fracture. So here you can see a nice picture of our red bone marrow. Here, the axial skeleton primarily is going to be the main contributor for blood cell production, but then we have our os coxa, the hip bones there, and then the proximal epiphysis of the femur and the proximal epiphysis of the humerus there. But you can see primarily most of your blood cells are made there in the axial skeleton. Our first clinical view today talks about the red bone marrow transplant. When do you need this? Well, in times in which your bone marrow, the red bone marrow, is depleted, usually after chemotherapy, right? Older chemotherapy treatments, some of the medicines that they were utilizing would just go after, it didn't discriminate, it would just go after cells that are dividing, because that's what cancer likes to do. It likes to divide, except its division is making abnormal cells. So some of these chemo treatments would just go after any cell that divides. So that's why people's hair would fall off, all right? And because those cells divide quite frequently. So anyways, point being is, same thing here in our marrow, right? We have, right, cells that are dividing, so that chemo or that radiation treatment would take it out. So of course, what we have to do for our marrow transplants is, one, find a match. Okay, somebody that is not going to cause tissue rejection. So relative normally is what we primarily want to go for, but somebody, beggars can't be choosers, so we'll go after anybody that shows a sign of not having a rejection of the tissue. But most of the time, what's the drug that usually they put people on after bone marrow or after any type of transplant? Anti-rejection drugs, which are immune suppressants. So things to help suppress the immune system so you don't reject the tissue there. All right, so moving on to well, how much time do we have? Oh my gosh, we're moving at a good pace. You guys okay with this? I know your brains are still recovering, all right, but we're going to start getting into some of the more interesting material here. Okay, so let's now get to a small microscopic aspect of chapter 7, bones. We're going to be talking about, all right, our cell tissues and the growth of bone, bone matrix and all that. So let's start off here by looking, keep in mind, bone is a connective tissue. And so connective tissue components don't change, y'all. Remember, there's 3 parts to connective tissue. Cells, you have the protein fibers, and then the ground substance. The protein fibers and the ground substance, we refer to that as the extracellular matrix. So we're going to just expand upon that knowledge that you already have. So now we're going to discuss, right, the specifics for bone tissue. So we're going to talk now and start off by talking about the cells. And then we'll talk about the extracellular matrix. We'll talk about the different protein fibers and the ground substance here. So let's start off with our cell types. So you have osteoprogenitor cells, then our osteoblasts, then the osteocytes, and then the osteoclasts. Those are the 4 cell types that we're going to discuss in this chapter. We discussed briefly about the osteocytes. Remember when we were learning in lab class how the osteocytes live in the lacuna, those little spaces inside the bone, and they maintain the bone. Okay, so they're like a lighthouse keeper living in a lighthouse. They maintain the lighthouse, all right? So they maintain the bone, and that's their job. We'll talk about all their different functions here. Okay, so let's start off with the first one. Osteoprogenitor cells. So the first statement up there says stem cells derived from mesenchyme. If you all recall, mesenchyme is that embryonic stem cell tissue that all connective tissue comes from. That's a review right there. Okay, so mesenchyme is like the primordial soup that all the connective tissue stems from. So this is nothing new here. Right, so osteoprogenitor cells are those stem cells that came from the mesenchyme. And they got an easy job. Their job is to divide. And when they do, they make 2 cells. One cell is going to be another osteoprogenitor cell. So it can divide again at a later time. And then the other cell that it produces is called the committed cell. And this committed cell is going to grow up and become an osteoblast. All right, so just make sure that you understand that. Osteoprogenitor cells are stem cells that are going to divide, and they're going to make 2 new cells. One of those cells is going to be another osteoprogenitor cell. The other one is going to become an osteoblast. And we're going to talk about what osteoblasts do here in a second. Where are these cells located? We just learned it. In the inner cell layer of the periosteum, and then in the incomplete cell layer of the endosteum. So these cells are found outside of the bone and on the inside of the bone. So that's where we're going to see them. Cool? They're easy. Osteoprogenitor cells. The next one are the osteoblasts. Write this down. Blast, build. That's what they do. B and B. Osteoblasts build bone. So these osteoblasts, we just learned where they came from. They came from the osteoprogenitor cell. And so they're going to build the bone. And they do so by secreting a substance called osteoid. Osteoid is that extracellular matrix. All right. And so it's like, I tell folks, it's like wet cement. It's going to dry soon. All right. But when the cell makes it, it's still kind of lumpy, bumpy, and kind of soft. All right. And so it's a semi-solid, all right, material. And it's organic, because remember, we learned that bone has 2 components to it, organic and inorganic. And this is the organic part here. Okay, the cells are also part of the organic. So this is going to make that kind of wet cement that it's going to later harden. And that hardening process, we call it calcify. We're all going to hit this, all right? I just want to kind of throw some of this up. So you got this cell that just starts to make this goo. And that goo is eventually going to harden and make our bones rigid. All right? But what happens to these cells is they make the osteoid and then they get stuck in it. It's like a painter that paints himself into a corner, or the carpenter that seals himself off into a wall. Right? Has anyone here ever read The Cask of Amontillado? It's an Edgar Allan Poe short story. If you like stories of revenge and you don't want to read a long story of revenge like the Count of Monte Cristo, all right, this is a short story. And it's kind of cool. This guy, I won't go into the story, but this one guy was planning this revenge on this other guy. So he invites him out to lunch. I think it's in France, in Paris or whatever. He invites him out to lunch and he drugs his drink. And so he somehow, I don't know how he does this because I believe they're in a cafe out in the open. He drags this guy down into the catacombs underneath Paris. And the guy starts to wake up and he's paralyzed. He can't move, but he starts to wake up and the other guy's sealing him up in one of the catacombs. He's going to leave him there for the rest of his life. And as he's laying it brick by brick, literally he's putting the mortar on and laying the brick, he's telling him why he's doing this to him. And he's literally sealing him up in there. Anyways, that's what it reminds me of. And, okay, so what happens to these cells is they get sealed, they get stuck in the osteoid, and then the osteoid starts to harden, it starts to calcify, and they then turn into osteocytes. They now are tasked with taking care of and supporting and making and maintaining the bone matrix, right? So that's their new job. So they built the bone, they made the bone, and now they're going to be stuck in the bone, and so they have to now, all right, monitor it and take care of it. So those are the osteocytes. So the osteocytes, that's their main job, is to basically detect any stress on the bone. So kind of like what I was saying to you earlier, when you start to gain weight or you go to that planet with more gravity, right? The bone will sense that increase and it will start to make more bone. So your bones can be stronger to support that new weight, right? All right, so those are the osteocytes, leaving one last cell for us, and that is the osteoclast. Okay, the osteoclast, these are kind of cool cells because we just were introduced to a cell, all right, group that made the bone. Well, now we have to look at a cell that actually will, I don't want to say destroy the bone, but it will start to tear down the bone. And so if you look there at the first description of an osteoclast, large, multinuclear phagocytic cells. Remember what phagocytosis is? It's cell eating. It's the Pac-Man version of the cell. It goes around and starts gobbling up the bone. And we'll talk about why it does that and where it does. The reason why it's multinucleated is because a whole bunch of these bone marrow cells just fused together. And they made this cell right here. You can see it there on the screen. That's what it looks like. So it's a multinucleated cell with these kind of tentacles hanging down. Right? And so what will happen is this cell, right, I want to go right back to this slide, where these tentacles are hanging down, they create this depression there. That's that resorption pit or lacuna that they call it. And what that's doing is that creates like a ruffled border type of thing. And so there's enzymes that the cell will excrete that will start to break down, all right, the actual osteoid. And in that process, it releases calcium and phosphate and whatever else was trapped in the bone matrix into your blood. Right? And it's one of the ways that your bone is able to remodel itself after you broke it. We'll get into that whole thing. But just understand the osteoclasts here, all right, their job is what we call bone resorption, the breaking down of the bone. And this is constantly going on in your body. When we learn about how the medullary cavity is formed, the osteoclasts are responsible for kind of hollowing out the inside of the bone. And that's what they'll do. Right? So those are your 4 bone types there. So you got your osteoprogenitor cells that just divide, and one of those cells that come from that division, the committed cell turns into an osteoblast. Osteoblast B build the bone, right? And then when they get stuck in the bone matrix, they convert into an osteocyte, and the osteocyte maintains the bone. And then we have our osteoclasts, and these these cells here will start to resorb the bone, right? In case we have to do bone remodeling, or, hey, say you're a little bit deprived of calcium. Your blood calcium levels have dropped down. Well, let's get some calcium from the bone. So we'll stimulate these osteoclasts to start to break down some of the bone to release calcium into your blood. And then at the same time, we'll tell the osteoblasts, stop building bone. We got to save that calcium for something else. So we'll learn about some of that stuff in this chapter. Okay, very important statement at the top of this page here. Bone matrix has organic and inorganic components. I just kind of talked to you a little bit about the organic part. That's the osteoid, right? So your osteoblasts are going to produce that osteoid. That's that goo I was telling you about. And a huge component, because the osteoid is the extracellular matrix. Remember, there's two components to the extracellular matrix, protein, fibers, and ground substance. So where's our protein? There's the collagen. Collagen is strong. So the high collagen content to your bone helps to give bone part of its tensile strength there. Then our ground substance is going to be made up of our proteoglycans and our glycoproteins. We're not going to see a lot of ground substance in bone tissue, right? Less ground substance, less water, more rigidity, okay, more strength, but less flexibility. So bones are great when it comes to tensile strength, right? So if you try to bend the bone a little bit or pull on the bone, it can resist that stretching pretty well. It takes a pretty significant amount of force to break a bone. But at the same time, we don't have a lot of flexibility because we don't have a lot of ground substance, not as many elastic fibers that you would see in other tissues and whatnot. All right, but just kind of keep that in mind when we're talking about the organic components here. The organic components are going to help, all right, with, all right, the formation of the what's the word I want to use? Well, that rigid compound component there. And I'll explain that in a second here. All right, inorganic components. So like I was saying before, the organic component, I want the osteoid, think of that as wet cement. Right? So we just put out this wet cement, and so now that wet cement needs to dry. So this is how we're going to dry our wet cement. We need the inorganic components to do this. Now, there's a couple different names up there that you'll see, all right? I just like to use the general bone salts. But there's, like I said, lots of different names that we can use here. So we're going to take, right, substances like calcium phosphate, right, and calcium hydroxide. We're going to take some of these different molecules, and what we're going to do is we're going to start, these molecules will interact and form this substance, and you don't have to know the molecular formula, right? But hydroxyapatite. So this hydroxyapatite, you can see what it's made up of. Calcium phosphate, hydrogen, oxygen, all right? And so what will happen is all these different molecules, right, what I like to call bone salts, will form this hydroxyapatite. And that hydroxyapatite will essentially kind of move into the osteoid. And that as that material, the hydroxyapatite, the bone salts are moving into the osteoid, it starts the process or causes the process of calcification. And it literally will turn that wet, semi-solid osteoid into a rigid material. Right? You can see all of this stuff that's found in that, that's awful. That's found in that bone matrix. Calcium carbonate, sodium, magnesium sulfate, fluoride, a whole bunch of other things, phosphate. So your bone stores quite a bunch of material that your body can use for other purposes. But it's the inorganic component here that is going to then account for your bone's rigidity. So you might see a test question on one of my tests talking about organic and inorganic components to the bone. The organic component of the bone contributes to flexibility of the bone. So if you were to get some sort of disease, let's say, that affects the organic component of the bone, and you're not able to produce as much osteoid, for example. So what would happen is your osteoid could be, you might not be making enough of it. So if you're not making enough osteoid, you will lose the flexibility that your bones could have, and your bones would be more brittle or stiff. If you get a disease that affects, right, the inorganic component to your bone, then you're not able to harden the osteoid, right? So your wet cement is not drying as well as it could. It's semi-dried, but it's not all the way dry. So what happens if you walk on kind of semi-dry wet cement? You sink in, yeah, you'll leave an impression, right? So it's still kind of soft, or it's more flexible. So conditions that affect the organic components, those bones will be more bendy, right? So keep that in mind. So essentially, really what will happen is these bone salts will deposit these crystals to form around the collagen fibers in the osteoid, and they'll cling onto the collagen fibers and cause that calcification and that hardening of the bone. So that's why what I just mentioned about those diseases there, when we're looking here at organic and inorganic components here, you have to have the right proportion. Just like when you're making a recipe or baking something, you got to have the right ingredients and the right amount of ingredients to bake whatever it is that you're making correctly. Same thing here when we're talking about bone formation. You have to have the right composition of organic to inorganic. And at any one time, if one of those swings out of the normal, like if you're having way too much organic, way too much osteoid, and not enough of the inorganic, the bone salts and the crystals, then the bones will be bendy. And vice versa. If you have not enough osteoid, but way too much of the inorganic, then the bones will become brittle. Right? So keep that in mind. So loss of those proteins, brittle bones, not enough calcium, soft bones, because you have too much of the organic or the osteoid for the soft bones. All right, thoughts, questions, concerns? Ooh, all right, good. I'm going to start here. I will start with this because this is a good place to start before we really get into the detailed aspects here of bone formation, because we're going to start to really get into, all right, how bone is formed, especially, right, during fetal development. All right, so we're gonna talk about that, but let's start off. Okay, so here's the first thing. First thing that's up there on that screen begins with osteoid secretion. So we need osteoblasts to put out that organic component, right, that wet cement there. And then what's going to happen is we're going to get those hydroxyapatite crystals, those bone salts are going to come along and then get deposited in the osteoid around the calcium, around the collagen fibers there. And then what will happen is that will cause that crystal formation and the hardening of the bone. That process, folks, you got to know the name of that process, calcification. I don't know anyone that calls it mineralization, but calcification. So that's what will happen. And so as that calcium comes in there, along with the phosphate and whatnot, we start to harden our cement. So there's a couple things that we need for this process. Obviously, all right, we need, right, the cells to make the osteoid, but just like if you're going to make a cake or whatever, you need the right ingredients. So the first one up there, vitamin D. This is why it's very important. Vitamin D helps with calcium absorption, specifically from your gastrointestinal tract, from the small intestine. It also is going to work synergistically with parathyroid hormone, which helps regulate calcium levels. Right? But important part is we absorb more calcium out of the digestive tract. Vitamin C, we don't really talk about it here, is required for the collagen formation. So when collagen is made, we know collagen are these thick protein fibers. But during the process of collagen formation, the ends of the collagen are frayed like that. And what happens is if you have vitamin C comes along and it cuts off the frayed ends. If you don't have vitamin C, the frayed ends remain and the collagen that you make is garbage. Some of you may have heard of scurvy. I think we already talked about that in this class, right? Scurvy is when you have a vitamin C deficiency. When you have a vitamin C deficiency, you can't make collagen effectively. And the collagen that you make is garbage, and we know that collagen is almost everywhere in all these different tissues. So people will complain of bleeding gums, right? For example, they'll have what we call petechial hemorrhages. You'll see it on their skin, little red marks all over their skin, right? Because of that ineffective collagen that was made. So that's one of the reasons why we promote vitamins, well, any type of, vitamin C in diets. You should not see a case of active scurvy. If you do, you need to find out what's going on with that person. If it's a kid, you got to make sure, because usually that's a malabsorption or malnutrition deficiency. So in the first world country, you should not be seeing any scurvy. And then we also need plenty of calcium and phosphate, because that's what's going to help with the hydroxyapatite crystal formation so we can get our calcification process. So all of these things we need, right, for effective bone formation. So we have bone formation. Now let's talk about the destruction of bone, or bone resorption. Right, so that involves a different type of cell, the osteoclast. And so the osteoclast cell is going to produce these what we call proteolytic enzymes, which are essentially these enzymes that are going to be produced by our famous lysosomes, right? And those lysosomes, remember, those are those membrane-bound organelles that live inside the cells. And usually the reason why they're membrane-bound is because the enzymes that they're making are dangerous to let run loose in a cell. So the lysosomes make these proteolytic enzymes, and then they exocytose and secrete those proteolytic enzymes onto the bone matrix there. And literally, right, those enzymes will break down the organic matrix. What is that? That's the osteoid. That's the collagen fiber. It starts to just eat away at both of those, components there, the osteoid, the collagen fibers. What was attached to the collagen fibers? The hydroxyapatite, those crystals. And so then those crystals can go out in the bloodstream for whatever reason. All right, so we break down the calcium and phosphate by the hydrochloric acid being produced by the osteoclasts. And this is one of the ways that we're able to increase our blood calcium or our blood phosphate levels, is activate the osteoclasts. Those osteoclasts will break down the bone matrix and release those minerals out into the bloodstream there. I forgot my water bottle, so I'm a little bit cotton mouth here. All right, so please know the difference between bone formation and bone resorption. Two important things, because as we move into some of these concepts here we're going to be talking about here shortly, it's really important that you know the difference there. All right, our second clinical view today is this Osteitis deformans, also known as Paget's disease. And so this is a really interesting condition. I've only seen it a couple times in my life, but basically our osteoblasts and our osteoclasts cannot get on the same page. So there's an issue. And so what you'll see with folks that have Paget's disease or Osteitis deformans is at certain points, you'll have some bones, not all the bones, but some bones, you'll see a huge increase in bone density. So the osteoblast in that area is just creating bone matrix. And then in some areas, you'll see a decrease in bone density because the osteoclasts are just going in and just gobbling things up. So they just can't get on the same page. So we'll see lots of bone formation followed by bone resorption. Or sorry, vice versa, going the wrong way. lots of bone resorption followed by bone deposition there. And so obviously the osteoclasts are going, I mean, you look at an x-ray of this person, they call it raindrop skull. You can look at it, it's crazy. It looks like someone literally just took acid and poured it onto somebody's, like acid rain was falling on somebody's head because you can see huge holes in the bone matrix on these x-rays there, right? Well, anyways, so what we'll see is, right, because the osteoclasts are resorbing at a higher rate, the new bone that gets made is garbage because the osteoblasts cannot keep up. The bone that they form, and we'll discuss this later on, not today, it's called woven bone. It's just an immature form of bone before it gets turned into the more permanent bone, right? But this immature bone is not very good, so therefore we're affecting the structural integrity of that bone. So these people are more prone to what we call pathological fracture. And they'll also get a condition called saber shin. So normally if you're looking at the shin from the side, it goes straight down like that. But what happens is over time, new bone deposition starts to occur on the front, and then this person's bone looks like a sword, a saber sword, and it just has this big kind of rounding on the front because the bone keeps getting deposited, and then there's resorption going on, and then more deposition occurs. Anyways, what we'll see in these patients is obvious bone deformities, but remember, if you're affecting the bone, what covers the bone? Periosteum. There's lots of sensory neurons or nerves that go to the periosteum, and so the periosteum becomes compromised, and so that patient will then have lots of pain involved too. Perfect. This is where we'll stop. We'll stop here. And we'll pick up here next class.